They say a crown isn't inherited, it's torn off, and sometimes the wearer doesn't shine but burns under its weight. Anne Boleyn knew this too late, when there was no turning back, when her hands, once bloodied with ambition, trembled, waiting for the edge of a foreign sword. Before being queen, even before being a lover, Anne was just another piece on a ruthless chessboard, moved with pinpoint precision by the interests of a family that dreamed not of love, but of power. Born into a minor nobility, her family, the Boleyns, were not among the oldest or grandest dynasties of England, but they were hungry. Ambition ran in their blood, and from the moment Anne was born, she was seen less as a child and more as a carefully positioned piece on a board where marriage, power, and politics determined survival. Anne's early years were spent not in the isolation of the countryside, but in the glittering courts of Europe. She lived in the Netherlands under Margaret of Austria, and later in France, serving Queen Claude. It was here, far from England, that Anne was moulded into something rare, an Englishwoman with the refinement of a continental court. She learned languages, music, poetry, and the art of conversation, but above all, she learned to watch, to calculate, to use charm as both shield and weapon. Unlike many noble women whose futures depended on obedience and silence, Anne understood that in the games of power, silence could be as dangerous as a sword. She studied how women at court influenced kings and dukes without ever holding formal power. She learned the subtleties of timing, when to speak, when to laugh, when to withhold affection until it became irresistible. By the time she returned to England in her late teens, Anne was not simply another lady-in-waiting, she was a force. The English court of Henry VIII was a place of ceremony, gossip, and rivalry. At its centre sat Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, whose beauty had faded and whose inability to give the king a surviving son had become an open wound. Henry's eye often wandered, and the women of the court knew well the dangers and opportunities of his attention. Anne entered this stage not as the most beautiful woman, by many accounts her looks were striking but unconventional, but as someone who radiated intelligence and intensity. Where others sought to please, Anne dared to challenge. Where others bowed, Anne sparred with words. Her dark eyes and sharp wit set her apart. She refused to become just another mistress to be cast aside. When Henry first pursued her, she resisted, refusing his offers, his gifts, even his letters. This defiance was not born of modesty, it was strategy. Every refusal deepened his desire, until want turned into obsession. Anne had made herself not only desirable, but untouchable. Yet Anne's rise was not simply a love story, it was a political earthquake. To have her, Henry would need to do the unthinkable, set aside Catherine, his queen of 20 years, and with her, the alliance with Spain and the favour of Rome. Advisers whispered against Anne. Courtiers muttered about witchcraft and seduction, but Henry was unmoved. He saw in her not just beauty but fire. Anne became the reason he defied the Pope, the spark that set England on the path to the Reformation, but this ascent came with a cost. For every step Anne climbed, another figure fell. Catherine was cast into disgrace. Her daughter Mary declared illegitimate, and the kingdom itself split between those who saw Anne as a beacon of new hope and those who branded her a usurper. In taverns and marketplaces, whispers painted her as the king's curse, the woman who lured England into sin. Yet inside the palace, her power grew. She was witty, commanding, feared and envied in equal measure. Anne Boleyn's rise was dazzling, but unstable. She'd secured Henry's devotion, reshaped the politics of England, and even forced Europe to watch in shock as the king bent his will for her. But in a world where women were expected to obey quietly, Anne had broken the mould, and with every new triumph, the enemies gathering in her shadow multiplied. For Anne, the crown was no longer a dream. It was within reach. But what she did not yet know was that the very crown she craved would one day burn her alive. Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in 1533, but her coronation was not the triumph she had imagined as a girl in the French courts. The golden crown glittered on her head, but the streets of London were divided. Some cheered, swept up in the king's grand display, while others muttered prayers for Catherine of Aragon. The queen cast aside. Beneath the bells and banners, resentment simmered. Anne's victory was built not on consensus, but on fracture. Still, within the palace walls, Anne moved with the authority of a queen who had bent a kingdom to her will. She was no passive consort. She involved herself in politics, backing reformist scholars, protecting allies, and directing patronage. Henry admired her sharpness in these early days. He liked a partner who challenged him, who dared to argue where others grovelled. Yet this same sharpness, which once drew him in, began to grate. Kings prefer mirrors, not rivals. Anne's most urgent task was simple and deadly: produce a son. Catherine had failed to give Henry the male heir he longed for, and Anne's rise was justified by the promise that she could. In September 1533, she gave birth to her first child. The infant was not a boy but a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immense. Henry masked it with forced celebration, but those around him could see the cracks forming. To a king obsessed with legacy, a daughter was no victory, it was a delay. Anne did not surrender. She became pregnant again and again, but the hopes of a son slipped through her fingers in miscarriages. Each loss chipped away at her security. Every failed pregnancy gave fuel to her enemies, who whispered that God was punishing Henry for setting aside his true queen. Catherine, though banished, remained a figure of loyalty and sympathy across England. Her daughter Mary still held the hearts of many. Anne knew that until she bore a son, her throne rested on sand. Meanwhile, her enemies multiplied. Courtiers who had prospered under Catherine despised Anne. Nobles resented her arrogance, and foreign ambassadors reported her every word to Rome and Spain. Even her relationship with Henry, once blazing with passion, began to sour. Where once he chased her with desperate letters, now he sought other women to soothe his frustrations. Anne fought back with the only weapon she had: wit, temper, and influence. She raged against Henry's mistresses, confronted him openly, and tried to tighten her grip on his affection. But each outburst made her appear less the enchanting partner and more the nagging obstacle. In the ruthless logic of a king, affection was conditional, power transactional. By the mid-1530s, Anne was queen in title but already a rival in Henry's mind. Her crown had not united the realm, it had fractured it. Her womb had not secured the dynasty, it had disappointed it. And her very strength of character, the quality that had made her rise possible, was now shaping the outlines of her fall. The crown still glittered on her head, but to many in Henry's court it looked less like a jewel of triumph and more like a target waiting to be struck. Anne Boleyn's enemies had long sharpened their knives in the shadows, but by 1536 they no longer needed to whisper. Her miscarriages had destroyed her value as queen, Henry's heart had drifted to Jane Seymour, and the kingdom itself was restless under her rule. All that remained was a final push, a plot to bring down the most powerful woman in England. At the centre of that plot was Thomas Cromwell. Once Anne's ally in the struggle against Rome, Cromwell now saw her as an obstacle. She meddled too freely in politics, challenged his authority, and threatened the reforms he was shaping. Worse still, her volatile temper had created enemies across the court, from noble families to foreign ambassadors. Cromwell understood Henry well enough to know that a king did not divorce his wives, he destroyed them. The challenge was to give Henry both motive and means. Henry needed freedom to wed Jane Seymour, but he also needed a justification that would protect his image. Simply setting Anne aside, as he had Catherine, would make him appear unstable, and England's allies would mock his weakness. What Henry required was something darker, proof that Anne was not merely unfit but dangerous. And so the whispers began. Rumours of adultery, of secret lovers in her chambers, of betrayal in the very heart of the royal marriage bed. The names of men were chosen carefully. Courtiers close to Anne, trusted musicians, even her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were absurd, but in Tudor England absurdity mattered little once the king desired belief. In April 1536 the trap was sprung. The accused were arrested one by one, dragged into questioning under the shadow of torture, their words twisted into confessions. Whether out of fear, coercion, or manipulation, testimonies piled up against Anne. She too was arrested, taken to the Tower of London in May. The sight of the Queen passing through Traitor's Gate shocked London. Some wept, others cheered, many simply watched in stunned silence. Anne was interrogated, pressed for confession she never gave. Her defiance remained intact. She denied every charge, her spirit as sharp as ever. But she knew the trial was not about truth. It was theatre, staged for Henry's absolution and Cromwell's triumph. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. A jury of peers, many of whom owed their fortunes to Henry, sat in judgment. The evidence presented was laughably thin, full of contradictions, dates that made no sense, and accusations that defied reason. But reason was irrelevant. The Queen was guilty before she even entered the chamber. Anne defended herself with eloquence, reminding the court of her loyalty, her innocence, her faith. For a brief moment her words stirred sympathy, yet sympathy could not outweigh the king's will. The verdict was unanimous, guilty of adultery, incest, and treason. The plot had succeeded. Anne Boleyn's enemies had done what once seemed impossible. They had broken the Queen, who had risen higher than any woman before her. All that remained now was the sentence: death by execution. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London not as a queen in triumph, but as a prisoner accused of the gravest crimes. She had once walked these same walls in celebration of her coronation. Now she returned through Traitor's Gate, her fate sealed by whispers and lies. For the first time in years, Anne's sharp wit and quick tongue could not protect her. The world she had built was collapsing brick by brick, and all that remained was despair. The Tower was no stranger to the condemned, but few prisoners had ever fallen from such heights. Anne's apartments were more comfortable than the dungeons reserved for common criminals, yet the air was thick with dread. Every sound of clanking chains, every step of the guards outside her chamber doors reminded her of what awaited. In those final days, witnesses recorded her swings of emotion, sometimes defiant, sometimes broken. At moments she laughed nervously, speaking rapidly as if to convince herself of her innocence. At others she fell silent, her eyes hollow, as though she saw beyond the walls of her cell to the scaffold being built outside. She prayed often, clutching her books of hours, scribbling notes and prayers into their margins. Faith, which had once emboldened her, now became her last anchor against the tide of despair. Her thoughts circled endlessly around her daughter Elizabeth. Barely 3 years old, the girl was now branded illegitimate by the very act of condemning her mother. Anne feared not for her crown, which was already lost, but for her child's survival in a court where bloodlines were everything. To her attendants, she spoke tenderly of Elizabeth, urging them to care for her, to protect her name, to remember that she was innocent of her mother's sins. The condemned men accused alongside her, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn, her brother, were executed first. Their deaths echoed into Anne's cell. The knowledge that her beloved brother had been put to death on false charges of incest was a torment she could barely endure. Yet she remained outwardly composed, clinging to dignity as the last thing her enemies could not strip from her. Anne's despair was matched by an eerie calm in her final hours. She spoke of dying with a good heart, telling those around her that she bore no ill will toward the king. Perhaps it was sincerity, perhaps resignation, or perhaps a calculated attempt to protect Elizabeth from further disgrace. Whatever the reason, she faced her end with a composure that stunned those who witnessed it. The crown had once seemed the pinnacle of her ambition. Now it was a memory that mocked her. In the Tower of London, stripped of power, influence and love, Anne Boleyn became simply a woman awaiting death, haunted by what might have been and by the knowledge that her story would not end with her, but with the daughter she left behind. May 19th, 1536. The sun rose pale over the Tower of London, casting long shadows across the stone walls. It was Anne Boleyn's last dawn. She had been Queen of England, a woman who once commanded the heart of a king and the fate of a kingdom. Now she awoke to meet death. Anne had spent the night in prayer, preparing her soul. Those who attended her later spoke of her serenity, as though she had moved beyond fear into something colder, more resigned. When her ladies entered her chamber at first light, they found her dressed simply, ready to face her fate. She chose not the jewels and silks of her queenship, but a modest gown of dark grey damask, with a crimson kirtle beneath and a mantle of ermine. A small cap covered her dark hair, which had been carefully bound to keep it from the sword's edge. Her dignity and dress was her final statement. She would not meet death as a disgraced traitor, but as a queen. At around 9 o'clock, Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, came to escort her. The scaffold had been erected on Tower Green, built not for the public spectacle of thousands, but for a smaller controlled audience of nobles and courtiers. Even in death, Henry denied her the grandeur of a crowd. Yet the select gathering who stood waiting, ambassadors, lords, soldiers and servants, understood they were witnessing history. Anne walked with composure, her head held high. Witnesses remarked on her calmness, almost uncanny, as if she had rehearsed this moment. When she mounted the scaffold, she turned to address the assembly. Her final speech was carefully chosen, stripped of accusation or bitterness. She praised Henry as a good and gracious king, declaring herself his loyal wife. Not a word of protest, not a breath of blame passed her lips. To some it was submission, to others strategy, a final attempt to shield Elizabeth from further disgrace. When she finished, she knelt upon the straw, folding her hands in prayer. Anne removed her headdress, exposing her long neck. She knelt gracefully on the straw, refusing the block that was usually offered. Instead, she simply raised her chin, hands clasped in prayer. Her ladies-in-waiting sobbed as they bound her eyes, their hands trembling. The executioner, a swordsman brought from Calais, was famed for his precision. He circled quietly, careful not to alarm her. In a practiced ruse, he called to his assistant for his sword, though it was already in his hand. Anne turned her head instinctively, and in that brief moment the blade flashed. It was over in a single stroke. No cry, no struggle, just silence. Her body slumped to the ground, her head rolling gently onto the straw. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by the hushed murmurs of those who could scarcely believe how swiftly England's queen had been erased. Her ladies, sobbing uncontrollably, gathered her remains. With no coffin prepared, her body was placed in a crude arrow chest, hurriedly carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There, beneath the cold stones, she was buried without ceremony, her grave left unmarked. But the echo of that mourning did not end on Tower Green. It rippled outward, staining every chamber of courtly life and reshaping the destiny of England. The Queen was gone, yet her absence weighed heavier than her presence ever had. Within hours of her burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, workmen dismantled the scaffold. The straw soaked with her blood was swept away, as though the king hoped to erase the memory as quickly as possible. But blood leaves marks no broom can reach. Henry VIII, ever mercurial, wasted no time. The very next day he appeared in mourning, and by the following morning he was engaged to Jane Seymour. Courtiers whispered in disbelief at the speed, some calling it obscenity, others inevitability. To them it was clear Anne's destruction had been plotted not merely to end her reign, but to pave the way for another woman's rise. In law, her execution was more than a death sentence. It was an obliteration. Parliament declared her marriage void, her titles stripped, her daughter Elizabeth branded illegitimate. The little girl, scarcely 3 years old, was demoted from princess to Lady Elizabeth, cast from the line of succession as though her blood no longer carried royal weight. To Henry, Anne had become a ghost to be forgotten. To Elizabeth, she became a shadow that would follow her forever. Yet the bloodletting did not stop with the Queen. Her brother George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, and 4 courtiers, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and the musician Mark Smeaton, had already been executed days earlier. Their deaths, branded as traitors and adulterers, left a stench of injustice that clung to the court. Few believed the charges, but none dared speak aloud. Fear had silenced even the most powerful tongues. Henry's reign grew darker in the wake of Anne's fall. The same paranoia that had condemned her soon spread further. Nobles who had once thrived at his side now felt the tremor of uncertainty under their feet. If a queen could be destroyed with rumours, who could be safe? Even Thomas Cromwell, the very architect of Anne's ruin, would eventually be consumed by the same machinery he'd set in motion. The people, too, felt the chill. They had watched Catherine of Aragon humiliated, seen Anne Boleyn rise like a storm, and now witnessed her head severed in silence. The lesson was brutal but clear. A crown could elevate, but it could also kill. England itself seemed caught in a cycle of sacrifice, each queen another pawn in Henry's restless pursuit of power and a male heir. But Anne's blood did not vanish into the soil. It seeped into the memory of a nation, into whispers of injustice, into the growing unease that surrounded Henry's reign. He might have buried her body, erased her name, and broken her line, but he could not erase the seed she had left behind in Elizabeth. What Henry believed was the end of Anne Boleyn was, in truth, the beginning of a far greater story. Anne Boleyn's legacy, then, was not buried with her body. It lived on in her daughter, it lived on in the Reformation, it lived on in history, but it also lived on in the whispers of people, who said that some nights Anne's spirit still walked the halls of the Tower seeking justice or perhaps revenge.